Welcome, the anointed ones. When you stop bowing to false gods, even the gods start to panic. Somewhere between blind loyalty and sacred awakening, you tripped over the cult leader's biggest weakness, truth, and now their whole empire is coughing up smoke. It wasn't part of your plan. You weren't trying to be heroic or rebellious. You were just thinking for yourself. And apparently, that's an unforgivable sin in a system built on worship, obedience, and overpriced enlightenment. Here's the thing. Studies in group psychology show that once one person in a closed belief system starts questioning the narrative, it sends a ripple effect through the entire hive mind. One awakened mind becomes a silent alarm clock in a room full of sleepers. That's exactly what happened when you started asking, wait, why does divine wisdom always require a monthly subscription? The cult leader's control wasn't broken by confrontation. It was undone by your awareness. You weren't loud. You weren't dramatic. You just stopped believing, and that alone was enough to make their throne start wobbling. You exposed that their power was never divine. It was borrowed, and once you stopped paying spiritual rent, their castle of manipulation started crumbling like expired incense. Now they're scrambling, trying to tighten their grip, rewrite their own prophecies, and gaslight the collapse into a spiritual test. But deep down, they know the truth. Their followers are starting to see what you saw, the puppet strings on the prophet. This isn't a story about rebellion. It's a story about revelation. The moment light hits the stage and the audience realizes the divine leader was just an actor with a script and an ego problem. Because sometimes the most catastrophic revolutions begin with something as simple as one person saying, "Actually, that doesn't make sense." Number 1. You didn't rebel. You simply remembered you were free. You didn't rebel. You simply remembered you were free. That's what changed everything. For the cult leader, control wasn't just about rules. It was about convincing everyone they had none. They built an invisible cage using guilt, fear, and divine authority, but you were never truly trapped, just hypnotized into thinking you were. When you started remembering your own mind, your own spirit, your own ability to think and feel without permission, that hypnosis broke. And that's when their kingdom started shaking. You didn't stand up to them screaming or protesting. You just stopped believing they had the right to own your thoughts. That's the moment their illusion cracked. Their power only ever existed because people agreed to it. Every yes was another brick in their temple. Every apology for being human was another offering to their false godhood. But you stopped giving your energy away. You began realizing that your worth wasn't tied to how well you obeyed, but how clearly you saw. And that kind of clarity is contagious. The cult leader called it betrayal, but it wasn't. It was awakening. You were reclaiming what was always yours, your inner authority. You remembered that truth doesn't need approval, and spirituality doesn't need supervision. Once you stopped asking for permission to feel close to God, the entire chain of command collapsed, because deep down, their empire depended on your forgetfulness. The day you remembered who you are, their throne became a chair, and a shaky one at that. They couldn't handle your freedom because it was effortless. You weren't fighting them, just existing beyond their reach. You made them realize that no amount of manipulation, rituals, or rehearsed wisdom could keep someone asleep once their soul wakes up. And that terrified them, because control can't survive consciousness. The cult leader's biggest mistake was assuming loyalty and love were the same thing. You didn't leave because you hated them. You left because you loved yourself enough to stop worshipping lies. You remembered your freedom, and that remembrance alone was rebellion. They mistook your peace for defiance, but really, it was liberation. You didn't destroy their system. You simply outgrew it. And when truth grows, deception dies by default. Number 2, their power was an illusion held together by agreement. They were never powerful. They were agreed upon. Their entire image of authority existed only because people silently accepted it as truth. Every nod, every bowed head, every amen was energy they used to inflate their status. Their so-called divine power was a group project built on fear and approval. The moment you stopped agreeing, the illusion began to fall apart. You didn't need to expose them publicly. Your quiet refusal to participate was enough to pull a thread that unraveled the whole thing. What most people never realize is that control doesn't survive without consent. Even silence can feed it, if that silence comes from fear. That's how the cult leader maintained their throne, by convincing everyone that questioning was sin and doubt was betrayal. They never had to prove anything because people were too afraid to ask. But you asked. Not because you wanted to rebel, but because something deep in you stopped resonating with their performance. And once you stopped agreeing, others started feeling the same inner dissonance. It spread like a frequency shift through the entire group. Their downfall began the moment people stopped worshipping and started observing. You made others see that the power they thought this person had was just borrowed belief. Nothing more. Every word that once sounded divine began to sound rehearsed. Every prophecy began to look like a script. The cult leader didn't lose control because you fought back. They lost control because their spell wore off. It's a strange thing to witness, how something that looked unshakable can crumble overnight just because one person stopped feeding it energy. But that's the secret of false power. It only works in agreement. The moment one heart says, "No, I don't believe this anymore," the structure begins to shake. You became that moment. You didn't plan it or even know it would happen, but your awareness broke their rhythm. They tried to guilt you, shame you, and call you lost, because your independence reminded them how dependent they were on belief. The truth is, you never destroyed them. You simply stopped contributing to the fantasy. Their power didn't disappear. It evaporated, because without collective belief, illusion has nowhere to live. Number 3, you spoke the language. They couldn't translate truth. You spoke the language they couldn't translate truth. It wasn't through shouting, preaching, or proving a point. It was in your energy, your tone, your refusal to twist reality just to keep their comfort intact. Truth has a sound that can't be faked, and when you started speaking it, through honesty, clarity, and presence, it disrupted everything they built. The cult leader thrived in a world of distortion. Their words were carefully crafted to control emotion, not enlighten the mind. They spoke in riddles to sound deep, but you spoke plainly, and that simplicity cut through their spell like lightning. They hated that your truth didn't need permission or applause. It wasn't performative. It wasn't wrapped in sacred jargon or mystical fog. It was grounded, raw, and unfiltered. That's why they couldn't stand it, because their entire existence depended on confusion. They built an empire out of mystery, but mystery without honesty becomes manipulation. When you started talking straight, their coded power lost its translation. Their authority stopped making sense. People began realizing they didn't understand half the things the leader said, and that realization came from the clarity you brought. Truth exposes without effort. It doesn't argue, it reveals. And that's what your presence did. Every time you refused to repeat their rehearsed phrases or fake enthusiasm, You were revealing the difference between authentic alignment and spiritual acting. You didn't need to debate anyone. Your energy made lies uncomfortable. You made their control mechanisms obvious without trying, because your truth carried frequency, not force. They tried to label you as arrogant or unteachable because they couldn't decode you. They mistook authenticity for rebellion. But the reality is, truth speaks in a tone that manipulation can't mimic. Calm, clear, and unwavering. And in that stillness, every deception trembles. You weren't trying to destroy their authority. You were simply being real in a place built on pretending. That was enough. When truth shows up, everything false has to either evolve or collapse. You didn't confront them. You translated reality back to its original language. And because they couldn't interpret it, they panicked. Their world began crumbling, not because you fought them, but because truth doesn't coexist with illusion. It replaces it. Number 4, you shattered their God complex by showing them their humanity. They built their entire identity around being above human, as if emotions, doubts, and flaws were weaknesses that only their followers were allowed to have. Their power came from that illusion of perfection, the idea that they were somehow closer to God, wiser, more evolved or immune to error. But you disrupted that image without even trying. You didn't argue with their divinity. You simply existed in truth long enough for their performance to look unnatural beside you. Your calmness, your groundedness, and your refusal to worship exposed something they had spent years hiding, that behind all the titles and theatrics was just another person, terrified of being ordinary. You showed them their reflection in real time. While everyone else bowed, you looked at them eye to eye. Not with hate, but with awareness, and that alone stripped away their costume. People who thrive on false godhood cannot survive eye contact with truth. They need worship to feel alive, because without it, they have to face their own emptiness. The more you stayed centered, the more their mask began to crack. They started reacting, getting defensive, lashing out, justifying themselves. And those reactions betrayed the very image they worked so hard to protect. The irony is that they preached transcendence, but couldn't handle transparency. You didn't expose them through accusation. You exposed them through peace. You were unmoved by their spiritual theatrics, and that unnerved them. They couldn't understand why their old tactics, guilt, manipulation, superiority, no longer worked on you. That confusion forced them to confront a truth they had spent years avoiding. They weren't divine. They were dependent. They depended on validation, on being worshipped, on being feared. Their divinity was a costume sewn from insecurity. The moment you stopped playing your role in their script, they lost their godhood. You didn't take it. It was never real to begin with. You simply held up a mirror, and what they saw wasn't sacred fire, but unhealed wounds dressed in holiness. That realization terrified them, because once people start seeing their humanity, the worship ends. And without worship, the illusion of godhood collapses. You didn't shatter their power. You revealed it was glass all along. Number 5. You became the uncontrollable variable in their psychological equation. Control only works when behavior is predictable. That's how cult leaders operate. They study reactions, map fears, and design emotional traps. They know what guilt to trigger, what praise to give, what punishment to threaten. It's all a psychological equation. If they push this button, you'll respond that way. But then something in you shifted. You stopped being predictable. You stopped reacting on cue. You became an anomaly in a system that depended on patterns, and that was the beginning of their unraveling. You started responding from awareness instead of fear, and that changed everything. When they expected you to beg, you went silent. When they thought guilt would break you, you showed peace. When they tried to flatter you, you didn't chase the validation. Each unpredictable response made their control tactics useless. Their script stopped working because you stopped playing your assigned role. You weren't supposed to think for yourself. You weren't supposed to pause before reacting. That pause, that stillness, threw off their entire rhythm. They couldn't read you anymore, and people who manipulate for power panic when they lose access to your emotional buttons. The cult leader built their identity around being the puppeteer, the master of response. But your detachment snipped the strings they used to pull. You became quantum, a free agent of consciousness they couldn't quantify or box in. They tried every psychological trick: guilt trips, isolation, false concern, spiritual intimidation. But none of it stuck, because you were no longer functioning from the emotional level they targeted. You stopped being their project and became their mirror. And a manipulator can't stand mirrors. They only thrive on reactions. As your energy stabilized, the system destabilized. Their control depended on your confusion, and your clarity dismantled it. You didn't fight them. You simply stopped being predictable. Your peace became unpredictable. Your silence became powerful. They couldn't label you, couldn't predict your next move, couldn't trigger you into compliance. To them, that was chaos. But to you, it was freedom. You became the variable they couldn't control, the question they couldn't solve. And that single disruption made their entire equation of manipulation collapse under its own faulty logic. Number 6, your emotional sobriety exposed their emotional addiction. They fed on emotion like it was currency. Every outburst, every tear, every apology gave them something to manipulate, a foothold in your psyche. Chaos was their comfort zone because emotional turmoil kept you dependent. The more unstable you felt, the more powerful they appeared. That was their entire game, to keep you addicted to emotional highs and lows so you'd never notice the strings they were pulling. But then you got sober. Not from substances, but from drama. You started seeing your emotions clearly, without letting them drive you. You stopped reacting just because they wanted a reaction, and that's when their whole system began to starve. Emotional sobriety doesn't mean you stopped feeling. It means you stopped letting your feelings be hijacked. You started pausing before responding, grounding yourself before speaking, and observing rather than absorbing. The leader didn't know what to do with that calm. They had built their entire dominance on your volatility, knowing exactly which fear to trigger, which guilt to activate. But when you met their manipulation with steadiness, it exposed their dependency. They weren't feeding you anymore. They were feeding off you. Your peace became their drought. Every time they tried to provoke you into guilt, rage, or despair and failed, they lost a piece of their power. They couldn't stand your calm because it made their control look ridiculous. They needed drama to justify their authority. See, you still need me to guide you. But your composure dismantled that illusion. You stopped taking their bait. You stopped being emotionally drunk on their approval. And for the first time, they had to face themselves without your reaction as a distraction. They began to wither in real time. Their speeches lost their force. Their manipulation lost its rhythm. You became the mirror reflecting their emptiness, and that reflection was unbearable. They thrived in emotional confusion, but your clarity made their chaos irrelevant. You didn't fight for power, you just withdrew your emotional investment, and their empire ran out of fuel. That's the irony. They called you cold, detached, unfeeling, but what you really became was whole. You no longer needed their emotional roller coaster to feel alive. You became steady, grounded, and free. And that's something they could never fake. Your peace exposed their addiction, and your calm became their collapse. Number 7. You turned their worship economy into dust. Their whole world revolved around being admired. Every compliment, every bow, every "you're so enlightened" was spiritual currency that kept their illusion funded. They needed to be worshipped to survive, because worship gave them a sense of identity. Without adoration, they were just another person with unhealed wounds and a craving for attention. They sold divine connection, the same way a business sells luxury. By convincing people they were lucky just to be in the presence of greatness. But what happens when the customers stop buying? The market crashes. And that's exactly what happened when you withdrew your belief. You were never just one follower. You were part of the energy supply that made their God complex possible. Every time you validated them, it was like making another deposit into their ego bank. They grew addicted to that energy because it filled a void they refused to heal. But the moment you stopped participating in their worship economy, the flow stopped. The divine authority they flaunted began to lose value. Without your attention, their holiness looked suspiciously human. The leader didn't lose power because people exposed them. They lost it because you and others stopped funding it. Belief was their oxygen. Your faith in their image was what made the illusion feel real, even to them. But when you reclaimed your own power, their divinity deflated like a balloon with no air left. The sermons felt empty. The promises sounded recycled. The followers began noticing cracks that were always there, but went unseen under the fog of admiration. By no longer feeding them with validation, you forced reality to show itself. They tried to guilt you into coming back, saying you'd fallen from grace. But deep down, they knew it was over. They could preach for hours, but without your belief echoing back, it sounded hollow. The empire of ego doesn't collapse through confrontation, it collapses through disinterest. You didn't destroy them, you just stopped believing in their myth. And belief is the breath of deception. Once you exhaled and walked away, their entire world suffocated under its own emptiness. You turned their worship economy into dust, not by rebellion, but by indifference. You stopped feeding the God they invented, and without your devotion, their throne turned into sand. Number 8, you exposed the leader's greatest fear, being irrelevant. They built their entire existence around being seen. Every speech, every divine revelation, every act of false humility was a performance designed to keep eyes on them. They weren't just addicted to admiration, they were terrified of disappearing. To them, relevance was proof of divinity. As long as people were watching, they could convince themselves they were chosen. But the moment you withdrew your attention, the spotlight went dark, and they had to face something far more frightening than exposure: being forgotten. They could handle criticism. It still meant you were looking. But your silence was different. Your absence wasn't rebellion. It was indifference. You stopped feeding the performance, and that starved them of the only thing keeping them alive: validation. Without your energy reflecting back at them, they became their own echo, loud, desperate, and meaningless. It was never about truth for them. It was about attention disguised as enlightenment. They didn't want to guide people. They wanted to be worshipped by them. You took that away by walking away. Obscurity is death to a false leader. When the applause fades, they can no longer hide behind noise. The silence becomes unbearable because it reveals what they truly are when no one's watching. Insecure, uncertain, and ordinary. They'll do anything to avoid that mirror. That's why your absence hurt them more than any confrontation ever could. You didn't try to ruin them. You just stopped orbiting around them. Without your gaze to define them, their identity crumbled. They'll call you ungrateful. They'll say you were deceived by the world. But that's just them trying to pull you back into their play. They're not angry that you left. They're terrified that you took the light with you, because deep down, they know their power was never self-sustained. It only existed through the people who believed in it. You didn't make them irrelevant. They always were. You just stopped pretending otherwise. And that's what they could never forgive. Not that you exposed them, but that you stopped caring. Indifference became your revolution. You didn't destroy their platform. You erased the audience. And without an audience, even a self-proclaimed God fades into silence. Number 9, you unknowingly triggered the mirror effect. They built their confidence on being the most evolved in the room, the one everyone looked up to for answers, wisdom, and guidance. But growth has a way of revealing what's real and what's rehearsed. When you started evolving for real, not just talking about it, you unknowingly held up a mirror to the leader's illusion. They weren't used to seeing progress they didn't control or take credit for. Your growth became proof that their supposed superiority was just stagnation, dressed as enlightenment. And that terrified them. Cults feed off comparison. The leader's status depends on everyone else staying small, dependent, and impressed. But you started outgrowing the mental cage without their approval. You were transforming quietly, learning, healing, seeing clearly, while they kept repeating the same teachings, the same emotional tricks, the same prophecies. That's when the imbalance became visible. You weren't supposed to outshine the master. You weren't supposed to evolve beyond their doctrine. But evolution doesn't ask for permission. It just happens, and it exposes what isn't moving. The more grounded and authentic you became, the more anxious they grew. Your presence highlighted what they lacked: growth, humility, and real spiritual depth. They had confused followers with progress, as if people's attention could substitute for personal evolution. But you proved that development is internal, not inherited by association. Your freedom showed them what their leadership could never give them: transformation that doesn't depend on control. That realization cut deep, because it shattered the narrative they built around being the sole source of enlightenment. Instead of celebrating your growth, they began competing with it. They tried to reassert dominance, subtly belittling your insights, framing your independence as arrogance, or calling your awakening rebellion. It wasn't rebellion, it was reflection. They saw themselves through you, and they didn't like the view. Your expansion was a living reminder of their spiritual stillness, and that's a mirror most false leaders can't survive. You didn't expose them intentionally. You just evolved in truth, and that alone was confrontation enough. Every step you took forward made their stagnation more obvious. You didn't shame them, you simply outgrew them. And in that quiet evolution, their illusion of authority dissolved. Because no one can call themselves a guide once the student surpasses the script. Number 10. You stopped mistaking their manipulation for mentorship. They called it guidance, but it was really control wearing a halo. Every lesson, every correction, every divine insight came with a hidden message. You can't trust yourself without me. That was the real foundation of their power. Not wisdom, but dependency. They needed you to keep seeing them as the source of all understanding, so you'd never realize you were capable on your own. For a long time it worked. because they disguised manipulation as mentorship. They told you obedience was growth, submission was humility, and doubt was rebellion. But the moment you saw through that mask, the entire structure began to crumble. You started noticing the pattern. How every time you showed strength, they called it pride. Every time you asked questions, they called it confusion. Their goal wasn't to build you up. It was to keep you orbiting around them. They fed on being needed. Their advice always circled back to one conclusion: that you couldn't see truth without their interpretation. That's not mentorship. That's psychological dependency dressed in spiritual language. When you realized that, their power stopped feeling sacred. It started looking small, desperate, and fake. Cults thrive on emotional trauma because trauma breeds compliance. They make you doubt your instincts, question your worth, and fear your independence. They tell you it's all for your growth, but what they're really doing is weakening your inner compass so they can steer it. Once you recognized that game, you began healing from it, and that healing turned their manipulation into noise. What used to sound like guidance now sounded like insecurity trying to sound holy. The beauty of real mentorship is that it makes you more confident in your own voice. Their version did the opposite. It silenced you, guilted you, and made you feel small. When you saw that clearly, the power dynamic flipped instantly. They didn't lose control because you fought them. They lost it because you stopped believing their words carried divine weight. You saw the transaction for what it was, a trade of your autonomy for their approval, and you refused to play. From that moment on, their authority shrank to its true size, a performance depending on your belief. You stopped mistaking their manipulation for mentorship, and in that clarity, their wisdom turned to dust. They were never your teacher. They were just afraid of your freedom. Number 11. You became proof that God doesn't need middlemen. You became the living contradiction to everything they built their power on. Their entire system was designed to convince people that access to God had to pass through them, that they were the translator between heaven and humanity. Every sermon, ritual, and rule reinforced that belief. It wasn't about faith. It was about control through spiritual dependence. They needed followers to see the divine as unreachable without their permission. But the moment you began hearing God directly, in silence, in intuition, in everyday moments, you broke the spell. You became evidence that heaven doesn't need management. That's what terrified them the most. Not your rebellion, but your independence. Because once a person realizes they can speak to the source without an interpreter, the hierarchy loses its grip. You didn't challenge their authority with arguments or confrontation. You simply bypassed it. You showed that divine connection isn't earned through rituals or titles, but through alignment and awareness. The leader couldn't compete with that because their entire identity depended on being the bridge. And when you stopped walking across that bridge, it collapsed under its own weight. You became proof that God's language is not confined to pulpits, temples, or chosen intermediaries. It speaks through intuition, through conscience, through the quiet moments no one can monetize. That's what made your awakening dangerous. It wasn't loud, but it was contagious. Others began to notice that your peace didn't come from obedience, but from direct communion. You didn't need their validation to feel close to God. You were the connection. And in that realization, their monopoly over the sacred world ended. They tried to label you as rebellious, ungrateful, or deceived, but those were just words used to mask fear, because deep down they knew if too many people found what you found, their throne would turn into dust. You didn't overthrow their system. You outgrew it. You proved that God doesn't require a mediator, only sincerity. Your relationship with the divine became the revolution they couldn't stop. You showed that heaven is personal, not performative, that God doesn't hide behind titles, robes, or rituals. In the end, you didn't just free yourself from their control, you freed others from the illusion that divinity needs a middleman to reach them. Number 12. You turned the spotlight inward, and their shadows couldn't compete. They had mastered the art of attention, the invisible fuel that powered their throne. Every glance, every ounce of belief, every whispered "Amen" kept their illusion alive. The cult wasn't built on truth, it was built on focus. As long as everyone's eyes stayed on them, they could maintain their image as the sole keeper of enlightenment. But when you quietly turned the spotlight inward, when you started questioning, reflecting, healing, and finding answers within, something remarkable happened. The audience began realizing they were the show all along. The moment you redirected your awareness from worship to self-awareness, the power structure began to tremble. Because self-awareness is the one thing a manipulative system can't survive, it's the kryptonite of control. You didn't attack the leader or call out their flaws. You simply began understanding your own. That shift was catastrophic for their illusion because they thrived on projection, keeping people obsessed with external salvation while avoiding internal growth. But when you turned inward, the entire theater of deception lost its stage lights. What made your move revolutionary is that it wasn't loud or rebellious. It was self-honest. You stopped needing validation from the divine performer and started realizing that the same light they claimed to own was already glowing within you. And once others witnessed your calm confidence, your ability to find peace without public worship or constant guidance, they started questioning too. They began asking why their enlightenment always required an audience, a ritual, or a fee. That question alone was enough to start the collapse. The leader's worst nightmare came true. People stopped looking at them and started looking within. Their grand stage, once bright with followers' devotion, turned into a dim, echoing room filled with silence. And silence is dangerous to those who profit from noise. You didn't need to expose their lies because your self-awareness made their manipulation transparent. You showed that true salvation doesn't come from charisma, charm, or spiritual branding. It comes from seeing yourself clearly. In the end, you didn't steal their light. You reminded everyone they never owned it. You turned the audience into mirrors, reflecting illumination back toward themselves. And when people finally saw their own light, the cult leader's empire of shadows vanished, not through confrontation, but through awakening. Number 13. You exposed their scripted divinity. Their entire persona was a masterpiece of performance, not spirituality, but stagecraft. Every word they spoke had been rehearsed, every gesture calculated to appear enlightened. Even their silence was scripted, timed to make followers feel awe instead of awareness. They didn't embody divinity, they performed it. Their wisdom came with dramatic pauses, mystical phrasing, and a tone engineered to sound holy. But it wasn't holiness, it was marketing. You didn't confront it with anger, you simply showed up as yourself, unfiltered, unpolished, and real. That alone was enough to make the cracks in their divinity start to show. The reason your authenticity was so disruptive is because it couldn't be replicated. They could mimic confidence but not clarity. They could act humble but not be humble. Your presence exposed their performance because real energy doesn't need choreography. It just exists. You didn't try to outshine them. You simply stopped participating in the illusion. And when realness enters a room full of rehearsed personas, it becomes painfully obvious who's acting. Their power depended on emotional scripting, making people feel chosen, guilty, or spiritually inferior on cue. But when you stopped reacting the way their script demanded, the entire play lost rhythm. They stumbled over their own lines, trying to maintain authority in front of someone who no longer believed the act. You didn't break their spell by fighting it. You broke it by being too genuine to fit in the production. What made your authenticity dangerous is that it was contagious. Others began noticing that sincerity didn't require performance, that real peace wasn't accompanied by dramatic speeches or exaggerated humility. Your calm made their intensity look forced. Your transparency made their mystique look suspicious. And soon people began seeing what you saw, that the leader's divine aura was really just stage lighting and smoke. In the end, you didn't expose them with accusations. You exposed them with truth. You showed that real spirituality doesn't perform. It lives, breathes, and loves without audience approval. Their theatrics collapsed, not because you attacked them, but because your presence revealed the difference between light and spotlight. You became the moment authenticity walked onto a stage built entirely on pretense, and the show could never go on after that. Number 14. You didn't destroy their cult. You revealed its inherent fragility. You never came to wage war. That was never your nature. You simply stood in truth, and that alone was enough to make their carefully crafted world begin to crumble. The cult was never built on strength. It was built on collective illusion, sustained only by unexamined loyalty and fear. You didn't bring destruction. You brought clarity. And clarity has a quiet, devastating power. It doesn't attack what's false. It exposes it. Once you stopped participating in their narrative, their supposed power revealed itself for what it truly was, a fragile performance sustained by belief, not reality. They mistook your calm departure for rebellion, but what really happened was spiritual gravity reclaiming balance. Their structure had always been hollow, dependent on followers feeding it attention, obedience, and validation. The moment you withdrew your belief, their system lost its oxygen. False empires don't collapse because someone attacks them. They collapse because someone stops pretending they're real. Your awakening was their undoing, not because you fought them, but because truth doesn't need to fight to win. You revealed something they couldn't afford anyone to see, that control only exists when it's believed in. Once the spell breaks, the chains turn to smoke. They had mistaken your trust for submission, your openness for gullibility. But when awareness entered the equation, you became untouchable, not through force, but through detachment. You saw that their so-called spiritual authority was just a pyramid built on insecurity, projection, and fear. And when you no longer stood beneath it, the illusion couldn't support its own weight. The beauty of your role is that you didn't destroy them. You simply stopped holding them up. You became the absence that revealed the lie. Their downfall wasn't your doing. It was the natural consequence of deception exposed to light. You didn't have to shout, protest, or prove anything. All you did was choose reality over ritual, awareness over obedience, truth over comfort. And that simple act of alignment became the earthquake they never saw coming. In the end, you proved that truth doesn't conquer lies, it outlives them. Their cult didn't fall because you fought it. It fell because you saw it. And once you truly saw it, it could no longer exist in the same form. Their world ended not with a battle, but with a quiet awakening. Yours. The story of how you unintentionally dismantled the cult leader's empire is more than a tale of defiance. It's a revelation of truth's unstoppable force. Every moment you reclaimed your freedom, every second you embraced authenticity, every act of awareness quietly dismantled the illusion that had held so many in chains. You didn't need weapons, confrontation, or grand gestures. Your presence, your clarity, and your refusal to participate in their performance revealed the fragility of what they had long called indestructible. You reminded everyone, and most importantly yourself, that power built on fear, dependency, and deceit can never withstand the light of consciousness. You became the mirror they feared, the variable they couldn't predict, and the witness to your own sovereignty. Your emotional sobriety starved their manipulation, your authenticity exposed their scripted divinity, and your direct connection to the divine shattered the myth of intermediaries. You didn't tear their empire down, you walked out of its illusion, and it collapsed under its own weight. Their God complex, their obsession with relevance, their dependence on worship, and their illusions of control all unraveled because truth has a frequency that cannot be contained. You simply held it, lived it, and breathed it, and in doing so, you reminded the world that freedom, clarity, and spiritual power are never granted by someone else. They are reclaimed from within. This isn't just about one person or one cult. It's about the principle that lies can only survive when we participate in them. You became the living proof that awareness and authenticity are more dangerous than any rebellion or uprising, because they require nothing but the courage to stop believing in illusions and start believing in yourself. Every reflection of your growth exposed stagnation. Every calm moment revealed desperation. Every step toward your truth highlighted the emptiness of false authority. You didn't destroy them. You simply remembered who you were, and in that remembering, everything false imploded. If this story resonated with you, if it awakened something deep within your own consciousness, make sure to join the movement. Subscribe to the channel for more insights that reveal the unseen layers of power, freedom, and truth. Hit the like button to amplify this message. Comment your experiences and reflections because your voice matters. And share this with anyone who needs to remember their own sovereignty. The more we awaken together, the less room there is for illusions to survive. Stay aware, stay authentic, and never forget the power of simply being free. God bless you.